not able to join. Just a heads up, we are planning to do some polls during the call today, and we do welcome you to participate in the chat box here in Teams. Though, as I said, we will be sharing this to the project website. So if you want to give us anonymous feedback, we would welcome that after the webinar via email. Encourage folks who are not speaking to mute yourselves unless you have a question, and we will open up for discussion a little bit later. So as I said, I'm Nate Aiden. I'm leading this project, and I'm fortunate to be working with my colleague Kylie Chang and Michiel on this project. They will be speaking on the webinar as well. I'll just first provide sort of a brief update of the project and preview of some of our key takeaways, and then I'll pass it to Kylie and Michiel to describe some of the key insights and some of the details from the survey. And then we'll briefly discuss the summary report outline that we've developed for the end of this year, and then talk about some next steps and opportunities for you to participate further. So in terms of previews of key findings, the survey was fairly comprehensive, and so thanks to those of you who took the time to complete it. We found that in terms of sector taxonomies, there's no one taxonomy that all the different companies and survey participants are using. There's a broad range, so we'll be discussing that, but there's no consensus there. In terms of slicing and dicing the chemical sector, most of the participants prefer product groups, but we'll show you the more detailed results there in terms of how to look at the different parts of the sector and different types of companies in the sector. Process emissions has been sort of a question that's come up, and they seem to be fairly well quantified by the companies and participants in the survey, though there's not a clear consensus on how to treat them versus energy-related emissions or fossil combustion emissions. Scope 3 emissions are obviously the crux for chemical companies, and 3/4 of the respondents didn't have a full grasp of their Scope 3 emissions. So I think the notable thing there is that it's not more than 3/4. But that's something that we'll obviously be discussing further. And then finally, in terms of barriers, there wasn't any consensus on any single barrier that's really impeding chemical companies from further action. It's rather a range of barriers. So that's sort of a preview of what we found in the survey, but we'll be discussing it in much greater detail over the next hour and a half. In terms of this project, we started it at the beginning of this year, and it's really intended to help scale up the number of chemical sector science-based targets among companies. And it's really, at this point, a fairly modest scoping project to figure out how we can best allocate our limited resources to support the chemical sector. So we're focusing on these scoping questions in this phase of the project, which runs through this calendar year. We gratefully acknowledge 3M for supporting this work, and this project would not be happening without their generous support. In terms of the project itself, we launched at the beginning of this year, and we've just completed the survey. We'll be presenting a summary of some of those results, and then discussing some next steps and sort of where we see the priorities for this work. In addition to sharing the summary with you, the purpose of today is to get your input on what you see as the most important issues for your sector, and how the Science Based Targets Initiative can most effectively provide additional support in our next phase of work. So with this, I'm going to pass it to my colleague Kylie Chang to describe some of the initial targets that we have and start to get into more of the substance here.
Thanks, Nate, and thanks everyone for joining the call. So this slide lists a distinguished group of chemical companies. Many of you are on the call. And so at this point, we have 22 chemical companies that have publicly committed to setting science-based targets. These are all listed on the SBTi website with the URL on the bottom there. And the companies that are in bold have targets that have been approved by the initiative, and they meet all of our target setting criteria. For the initiative, this is exciting. First step to have all of these companies involved. But what we are hoping to do with this project is provide the resources to multiply this list by a factor of 10 and to have broader coverage in the sector. So that's what we are trying to explore and support in this project, as well as in this call. So the next slide just provides um, well, the next slide we want to recognize and thank the companies and organizations that have participated in our last expert advisory group meeting. Last time we were joined by an illustrious group, and we are joined by 3 new companies. So thank you to all of you for staying engaged and for taking the time to fill out our stakeholder survey. We're really grateful that for all of the detailed responses we received, which will help us better understand the barriers that the chemical industry, has when setting science-based targets. And so the next slide just provides a high-level overview with target setting. So the initiative offers a variety of methods for setting targets. Absolute contraction is a simple, straightforward approach, and it's applicable for most sectors, including chemicals. Through this approach, all companies reduce their absolute emissions at the same rate, irrespective of initial emissions performance. So the minimum reduction for targets in line with scenarios that limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius is 2.5% in annual linear terms, and the minimum reduction required for targets in line with 1.5 degree scenarios is a 4.2 annual linear reduction. We also have physical intensity targets. It's emissions reductions relative to a specific business metric, such as production of output. So for example, ton of carbon dioxide per ton of chemical product produced. And we'll discuss physical intensity targets more in this webinar, but physical intensity targets can vary by the emissions intensity in the base year, a company's projected activity growth, and in some cases, sectoral budgets. So we also have economic intensity targets, which uses the greenhouse gas emissions per value added method, or GEVA. And finally, we have supplier engagement targets, which we use for some scope 3 targets. So you can see here on the table on the left that we have a summary of the different approaches for the 8 companies that have approved targets at this point. And the takeaway here is that there is no one approach or method for all companies, and certainly not for chemical companies. And we know that all of you are unique in your product mix and circumstances, and so we are trying to come up with robust resources that address the industry's diversity. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Mikhail to go over the survey results. We have lots of time for discussion, so if you have any questions on this first part, we can certainly circle back, but with that, I'll pass it to Mikhail.
Thank you, Kylie. And Laim, yes, I think the slides will be shared after the meeting and so will the recording. But yes, count on that. No need to make notes. Thanks all for joining. As you maybe already have seen in the chat, we all encourage you to provide feedback either by just orally doing it or by doing it in the chat. But obviously the whole purpose of this call is that we learn from your insights. So please give suggestions, ask questions, agree, disagree as often as you like. That's the purpose of this call. We basically thought it would be a good idea to continuously share some results of the survey from you with you. Then use that as a starting point for a specific follow-up question that we have. Obviously, we are not going to repeat the survey questions, but having seen the results, we have next questions for discussion. Typically, we use polling software for that. So in the chat, you already see where you can go to for the polling. So maybe, of course, while listening to us, please already do so. You can do that on your mobile, but also on a separate screen on your PC. And so we'll ask a polling question and then we discuss the results. And in that way, we try to get all your feedback and also have a more in-depth discussion with this relatively large group of people. We are a bit handicapped because I was supposed to share my screen, but somehow that doesn't work. So we'll see how it goes, but I'm sure we'll find a solution if it becomes difficult. And I see we have a question from Tirapon. Go ahead.
Hi, sorry, this is just a bit administrative, but I do not have access to the chat, and I'm not sure if other participants have the same problem.
If you do, what you could try is leave the meeting and log on again, but then logging on through internet rather than through Teams. So make sure that Teams doesn't know your organization, because this might be the result of your organization's Teams policy. So if you enter the meeting just by using Teams rather than over internet as an anonymous guest, then that's what you could try. In case that wouldn't work, then please don't use the chat, but just react orally. Let's go to the next slide. I hope that works. One of the two should. Yes. Let's go to the next slide, Kylie.
If you want to try to share again, I think it could work, but it's up to you.
Let me try that.
Okay.
I think nothing changes, right? No, I think this doesn't work. Maybe we can go back to you, Nate.
Sure. Okay. Because it did pop up a request before. So I thought it might have worked.
I sent a couple of these. Okay, so we have 59 respondents from the survey, 40 of which are working for a chemical company, and 8 of these work for chemical companies that do not produce products that lead to greenhouse gas emissions at the end of their life. And basically, I think you saw all. Basically, I think you all saw the report which we intend to add as an annex to our report at the end. Interpretation comes in the main body. But in general, I think it's fair to say that we checked whether we got different responses if we looked at all or just at the 40 respondents working for a chemical company. And that didn't lead to big differences. So I think also the people who responded who do not work for a chemical company understand the chemical industry pretty good. To Riva's question in the chat, do you need to register? No, I don't think so. Hopefully, if we are at the first poll, you will be able to vote. If not, please say so. Let's go to, no, I should say something else. And The majority of the companies that responded, of the respondents working for chemical companies, are considering science-based targets. That basically means that we have maybe a not fully representative cut through of the chemical industry, but a sample of respondents that is above average interested in this methodology, which in a way is good because it was quite a difficult survey. It was quite a content-heavy survey, which required quite some understanding of what we were after. I think we also got that back in some of the comments. I also think that we got lots of text that people added to substantiate their answer, which really showed that people understood what we were aiming for and thought beyond the question and provided some further feedback. We will not go through all the details of that, but you can find it in the report that we shared in the weekend. Let's go to the next question, to the next slide. I think some results just from the survey of what we can learn about the different scopes, and we did ask a couple of questions to understand to which extent you have data, which of course is relevant when setting targets to specific scopes. So I think the survey confirmed that chemical companies, you kind of know your scope 1 and 2 emissions. You also know your scope 3 emissions, but for that it is with insufficient accuracy, you indicated yourself. I think it also matters whether you use fossil energy sources as a fuel, scope 1 and 2 emissions, one mainly, or as a feedstock where they end up in products and contribute to scope 3 emissions. The vast majority of you knows which share of energy carriers is burned and which part is used as feedstock. Then on scope 2, of course, is those emissions that you kind of that stem from procuring energy carriers. I think it's generally known that electricity is relatively easy to decarbonize, to get to low emission factors. Maybe more difficult for heat. If we want to go that way, then of course it's relevant to understand whether you know which share of your scope 2 emissions comes from electricity and which part from steam, and you do. And of course the chemical industry quite often uses combined heat and power plants. So also auto-producing electricity. If we would want to factor that in, then of course it's again relevant whether you know how much electricity comes from CHP, and you do. So if we want to, we have the possibility to kind of make all these distinctions because you do have the data to work with that. On scope 3, I think it's also fair that many remarks in different questions boil down to remarking that your industry is quite heterogeneous. You make an enormous amount of products. These products have often many different applications, or they are processed further by other chemical companies. So may be different than for some other industry sectors. It is difficult to speak about the downstream and also to some extent the upstream emissions of the chemical industry. There's a lot more behind that also in a company at the company level. Let's go to the next slide. Then we were also thinking now what should be if we say we are refining the science-based targets methodology for the chemical industry, then what is it we are actually talking about? What is the exact scope and what is a scope and also a classification of the chemical industry? Because as it's so heterogeneous, we may well need to subdivide it. What is the classification that you could work with? So we asked for that. Next slide, please. And the question then was, what taxonomy do you use? We asked specifically for the CDP, the NACE, the NIECS, the GICS classifications, the taxonomy. I think the results showed that many different taxonomies are used. Some companies use several. There's no single winner. CDP was most mentioned, but also all the others were mentioned. Then there was the option to say that you use another, but no classification scheme was entered there more than once. So I think we got the most relevant ones, although we will get back to that in a bit. We got the most relevant ones. There's not a single winner, but CDP is used most. We were also interested in the question whether or not to include pharmaceuticals, where I think many of you didn't have an opinion, but some said yes and some lower share said no, but it wasn't very clear cut. I think reasons for saying yes is that pharmaceuticals are like specialty chemicals, and reasons for saying no are that the chemical industry has so many bulk volume processes that these pharmaceuticals in small volumes, different processes, are something completely different. And I think ultimately it boils down to the chemical industry is very heterogeneous, and if you compare it with specialty chemicals, then maybe pharmaceuticals should be in. Obviously, if you compare it with ammonia plants or crackers, then it's logical not to put them in. So a bit mixed answers there. Then we also asked whether science-based targets methodology to be developed should apply to biofuels. There we got a more convincing yes, for example, as a consequence of the link with other bio-based chemicals that would be covered by the methodology anyhow. And then this is the moment where we start polling, so I hope it goes well. I can also see the polling screen. Let me first introduce the question. As I said, there's not one overarching taxonomy that everybody of you uses, and we were wondering whether that would be a barrier to set science-based targets. So if you get, for example, CDP as a taxonomy to use in the science-based targets methodology when setting a target, would it be a barrier if you don't have that? And likewise for all the others. Maybe you can go to the next slide, Nate. This is the moment that the poll should be opened. Let's try to do that in a different way. I think the poll now opened. So maybe you can indicate whether you think the lack of one overarching taxonomy acts as a barrier for companies to set science-based targets, whether it would for you. Yes, no, or no opinion. If you don't know, then please answer no opinion, so that at least it becomes clear to all that you have answered and that this is something that you don't feel very strong about. Nate, maybe you can already go to the next slide. Nate? Oh, you are, likely. Go back, please, Nate. Yes. Okay. Okay, so unfortunately, the only one who can see the polling results is me. So what I will do is I will share with you continuously what comes out of the polling. And Nate, for your information, I control the polling. I think now 5 people have voted, slightly more. So please continue to vote. And the question is whether the lack of one overarching taxonomy is a barrier for you to set science-based targets. And yeah, please continue to vote. I still see some votes coming in. Are there people having trouble to vote at this moment? Because at this moment, everybody should be able to vote. If so, just tell us or put it in the chat. There will be more polling questions, so it is relevant that you all can vote. Okay, I take that as you can all vote. I still see votes coming in, which is fine. Please continue to vote. But meanwhile, I can share with you that almost all of you have an opinion. 50% says no so far. 38% says yes, it is a barrier. And 13% doesn't have an opinion. Could I invite the people who voted no to indicate the reasons why you voted no? Just feel free to speak up. Don't forget to unmute. So anyone, why did you vote? Anyone who voted no, why did you vote no? How can you overcome that?
Hi, this is Ridhima Kapoor from Novozymes. So I voted no because we overcame it just by setting a absolute target, sort of with a global method. We didn't look for a sector-specific methodology because it didn't exist at the time. So that's how we overcame it. We ignored taxonomy entirely.
Okay. Thank you. I understand that if you ignore it, that the lack of an overarching technology is not a barrier. That's insightful. Other reasons to vote no or also to vote yes, and you can also put it in the chat, whatever you prefer.
Can I come in here? This is Alka from Tata Chemicals, and I also voted no because at the end of the day, it's how you strategize in the organization and have absolute reduction. And so, so whatever number comes out of the taxonomy you use, it really doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you're still talking about absolute reductions.
Okay. Any other reason to vote yes or no?
Hi, Julia here from Croda. Yeah, I guess I voted no for the same reason at the moment. I mean, I'm hoping that maybe that's why we're all here, but at the moment, whilst we're on the absolute 50% reduction by 2030, you know, it doesn't make any difference whether or not the chemical industry will be given a slightly lesser gradient without, you know, with still being on 1.5 degrees and not overshooting that 1.5 degrees is a kind of, I guess, where we're hoping to get to.
Okay,
but at the moment
thanks.
It's 50%, and you know there's not really much else that we can do about that.
Thanks, and thanks also for those providing reasons in the chat. Anybody also willing to explain why you voted yes? This is a barrier. And maybe also suggest a solution if you would have one.
Yeah, Liam McCarroll here from Univar Solutions. Now, I don't think that it's a barrier for us as we look to develop targets, but I responded yes more broadly, because if we want to bring more organizations in and help them understand, you know, from their perspective, more specific guidance, then I believe having a single taxonomy where people can identify where they sit more easily would be helpful. But I agree, you know, in response to the comments that have already come, this is probably something that supports those organizations who are yet to start on the journey, as opposed to those who are already en route.
Okay, thanks. Riva, would you mind giving some background to your answer in the chat?
Sure. So it's still not clear to me whether some chemical sector subsectors may need different means to account. So they may need different taxonomies. However, I think that we do need to have consistent standards within subsectors and ultimately within sectors in order to have a common accounting system.
Okay.
So that's the reason. So I wasn't clear. The question for me was two questions. So I had to answer yes to one of them, but I'm not clear about the other one.
Okay, thanks, that helps. And I also see the other inputs coming in over the chat. Thank you for that. I assume all of you are looking at the chat. Nate, in view of time, by the way, we got more yeses now than no's, 47 versus 37. And Nate, I suggest in view of time that we skip the next question and continue afterwards. Do you agree?
Sure. Yep.
Okay. Then yeah, let's do that. Maybe you can go to the next slide, and the next slide, and the next, and yet again the next. Yes, and then a question that we have discussed internally quite a lot is where the boundary is of the chemical industry. Basically the starting boundary, and of course most of the hydrocarbon production starts in steam crackers where naphtha is converted to ethylene, propylene and other high value chemicals. Of course there's also ammonia and other inorganics, but most starts in the steam crackers. The question here is where the boundary of the chemical industry should be, and what we are asking for is whether it makes sense to say that the boundary is such that the production of naphtha in refinery is not part of the chemical industry, but the conversion of naphtha in steam crackers to high value chemicals like ethylene and propylene should be included in the chemical industry. I hope the question is clear, and I will start the polling. Which, if all is well, I just did. Yes. So please let us know if the question is unclear, of course, just by speaking up. But if not, then please vote whether the threshold should be production of naphtha not in the chemical industry sector, conversion of naphtha into high value chemicals in the chemical industry sector.
And for folks who have just joined, the link for polling, for participating, is in the chat box.
Yes, and also on top of the screen that you are sharing.
Just a quick question from me. Are we just talking about scope 1 and 2 here? Because if we start to bring in scope 3, anyway, it's all going to be included, isn't it? So are we talking about the scope 1 and 2 target here?
I think it's a fair remark, and yes, although even then, if you talk about these targets for a company, for example, converting petrochemicals to plastics, then the upstream part would still be included.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, the simple answer is yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
So far I see that yes, no, and no opinion all have 33% of the vote. So I'm assuming that many of you haven't voted yet, or we have a statistical interesting situation here. But if the question is, if you need more background on the question, then please please let us know, and if not, please vote. And while you are voting, maybe some of you could also just verbally explain why you think this is a correct border between the chemical sector and the refinery sector, or why this is not. It would help us in our thinking.
Yeah, hi everyone, and as follow-up to the earlier discussion and the context that this question is framed, in the context of whether it should be in the scope 1 and 2, then I voted in favor of excluding it from 1 and 2 because it happens to be then in category 1 of scope 3.
Okay. Category 1 being purchased goods and services, yes. But the steam cracker emissions should be chemical sector, right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that naphtha is beyond the gate. It's considered to be upstream of petrochemical industry.
Okay, how about others?
So just, this is Nate, a little bit more context here is that we're seeking to have a harmonized boundary between the chemical sector project and the SBT oil and gas project. And that the oil and gas project is excluding most petrochemicals and other things. So one output that we're seeking to have from this scoping phase and summary document that we put together later this year is to describe what's in and out of this sector project, but also what's covered by oil and gas, and if there are some processes that are sort of in between, and just have some understanding and clear logic there. So you on this call are the experts, and so we appreciate any input and suggestions you can provide here.
Maybe Nate, you can answer Andreas's question, being what the rationale is for oil and gas to exclude naphtha.
Well, I think that frankly, this is an expected demand growth area that they seek to focus on combustion of their products as the main target area for the time being. But I certainly would not hazard to speak on behalf of any oil and gas company, but that's one sense of the argument that I get from those discussions.
Okay, and I see that 39% of you voted yes, 39% had no opinion, and 22% voted no. So quite a lot of you have voted. Thanks for that. Anybody who voted no, so who disagrees, could you please indicate why?
And Michelle, I mean, considering the silence in the call, I thought I could slip in again, although I voted for yes and explained why earlier. There is, I mean, just to keep this, like broad-based, there is also the concept of, oil to chemicals, where, refineries are, seen as also the units that are making petrochemicals, right? So from that viewpoint, and in consideration of how things may actually change in the future, there is also a graying of boundaries between what we call as an oil and gas, like in a pure sense, versus what you call or classify under petrochemical sector.
Okay, and I see an answer from Braskem, analyst from Braskem, petrochemical or plastic resins. Yes, considering only scopes 1 and 2, since naphtha is our raw material included in scope 3. Yes, thank you. Any other different reason to vote no that somebody can still share to further help us to develop our thinking? Andreas asks where naphtha sits in the typical industry classifications, closer to chemical or closer to oil and gas. Nate, do you want to answer that question, or would you like me to do so? I'm happy to.
I think, yeah, go ahead. I think it depends on the classification. So, but go ahead, Mikhail.
I think for the classifications that I know, the conversion of naphtha in steam crackers to high-value chemicals sits in the chemical industry. And I see if they end up with a different pathway, though, won't that just make Braskem scope 3 harder? Should we not be aligned? Interesting question. And we see on behalf of PTT Global Chemicals, we are a petrochemicals and a refinery company. We have both. Naphtha would be under our refinery operations or oil and gas. Okay. Thanks. Let's leave it at that. The voting hasn't changed since I told you last time. So 39% yes, 22% no, and the rest no opinion. In the slides that I already promised that we would share, we will of course share the percentages in whatever way that we can figure out to do that, so that you also have the handy at hand. Nate, can we go to the next slide? Next. Then, of course, as we introduced, the chemical industry is a very heterogeneous sector with products ranging from specialty chemicals, potentially even pharmaceuticals, to high-value chemicals, really bulk chemicals that are very energy intensive, relatively low value per ton, and high emissions. Completely different processes, completely different abatement options. So that, of course, leads to the question, and that's one of the purposes of this project. Should we maybe subdivide the chemical industry in different subsectors and set different targets for that, taking into account that for some of the products, some of the subsectors, it might be easier to meet the target than for others. Next slide, please. So we basically thought until we had the first expert advisory group meeting that there would be three potential, actually two potential ways of doing it. Doing it by product, so separately for high value chemicals or ammonia or whatever. Doing it on a subsector level, so making a difference between base organics, base inorganics, polymers, consumer chemicals, specialty chemicals, for example. And you added, you can also do it on a product group level or at a unit operation level, product groups like plastic surfactants and solvents, and unit operations such as reaction separation. Basically, we asked the preference in the survey, and production group level, as suggested by you in the first expert advisory group, was the winner, very closely followed by product level. So I think we can take these two as if we want to make a subdivision as the way to subdivide. And I think the unit operation level reaction separation was clearly not the methodology deemed most adequate. So I think what we took from this question is we should look at if we want to subdivide, we should split up on a product level or a production group level. Nevertheless, I see the question in the chat what the rationale is for setting up different targets if we want to go for a future decarbonization. So I translate that into why would we subdivide at all? Nate, maybe can you answer that question?
Sure. Just looking at the question here. What is the rationale for setting up different targets if we want to go? Is that the question?
Yes.
Generally, the SBT initiative is trying to address a broad range of companies and sectors. And in the sectors that have high demand growth, we have introduced physical intensity targets in order to give companies some flexibility in achieving their target while still having a clear link with well below 2 degree scenarios and outcomes. And so that's linked with this sector decarbonization method that we developed 5 years ago that we're planning to update next year. And that links with this question in terms of the sort of unit of analysis. Does that answer your question, Sigrid?
Maybe I'm a little bit too absolute thinking here. Yeah, so for me, the thing is whether it is being less or small, everybody needs to contribute into that one. So I see a total coming. What I see more is a timely differentiation. The more complex we get in the value chain, yeah, the more we need a proper coupling across sectors, maybe even. So for me, it's not a general part of distinguishing in between. It's more the timeline. This is why I'm actually struggling a little bit, and I cannot say that I have finally made up my mind here on that point. Yeah.
Sure. I think it's a good point, and it's one that we also go back and forth on the initiative. I can say, although there's a lot of interest in the sector decarbonization approach and these physical intensity pathways, the actual use of that for target formulation, as we've already heard, in fact, during this call by some of the companies participating, is quite limited. Companies much more often do accord with our absolute contraction approach, where everyone just reduces in parallel.
Then I also see Riva's question, but maybe you can give a little bit of background, Riva. I see David agrees with you, but what is it exactly that you are saying?
Right. So actually, thank you, David. So that's helpful because Air Liquide and Linda over here are big players in the industrial gas space, and we have I think Messa's also on the call. But the issue is that we're a small number of the participants. So the method of counting on the slide we're looking at here is taking a proportion of the total that have a particular view. And so the subsector response is saying that, it distributes the results. And what I was saying is, well, could we see results by subsector? So could we see results, particularly for this question, on what the industrial gas companies are saying? Because if 100% of us feel that we should have a subsector method, then I think that needs to be taken into account.
Okay, and as I put in the chat earlier, we didn't ask in which subsector each chemical company classified itself. What I didn't put in the chat is that we do see which company answered what. We also promised not to share that, so we can only share aggregated findings. On industrial gas, we also said that we would share verbatim text, and I think we got a couple of inputs from on industrial gas specifically, where in the industrial gas subsector saying that the industrial gases subsector should be treated separately and not as part of the chemical industry. So in that specific example, I think we know. And how we'll take that up is by one-on-one discussions with them to understand the background of that, as it seems to be quite specific, their wish for their subsector. But yeah, that's basically where we are on this one.
I can only agree with that. Thank you very much for taking that into account. This is David speaking.
Okay. Thanks. Let's go to the next slide. And this is again a poll. So assuming that indeed we go for products and product groups, which was the intention we had when we were preparing this slide deck, knowing that there is value in if a subsector wants to be treated separately to do so. But which one of these would you like to see intensity pathways for? So which one of these would you like to see treated individually? What you can now do is you can input either products or product groups, but you can also upvote and downvote all the inputs of others. And as you may have seen, I have already put in 17 that we could think of. So if you think it is relevant to have a specific product or product group, then please look whether it's already in the list. If not, add it and upvote or downvote. And as hopefully all of you will also be entering products and product groups, every now and then push on the yellow button, loading new responses, so that you see all and can upvote or downvote all of them, rather than just a selection. So I see some voting is going on. For now, hydrogen is in the lead. Together with pharmaceuticals, interestingly, and high value chemicals, but please continue to add and to vote. Don't forget to every now and then load other inputs by pushing the yellow button.
Michiel, can you remind us of the difference between specialty chemicals and high value chemicals? Yes.
So specialty chemicals are those chemicals where you really need a lot of steps. I'm exaggerating, but to paint the perspective, you really need a lot of separate steps to convert platform chemicals, the basic building blocks, into very complex molecules, very carefully connected together to get a high value per kilogram. So the really complex molecules. High value chemicals, despite their name, are basically the opposite. That's just the cracker products that you get at the start of the whole value chain, where you just throw naphtha in a steam cracker and get ethylene, propylene, and the other high value chemicals. So that's basically the output of the crackers, and the name high value chemicals is used to indicate that these are the valuable outputs, the ones generating most of the income of the crackers. But their value on a per kilogram basis pales in comparison to the value of specialty chemicals.
Thanks.
I see that voting is still going on. Feel also free to add new chemicals, products, or product groups. I also see some downvoting is going on, which I like. So continue to do so too, please. And don't forget to regularly push the yellow button so that you have a complete set to prioritize. And I see a few double entries. Don't worry about it. We'll sort it out later. Still see voting going on. To give you an idea, the current top 3 is high value chemicals. So the cracker products, followed by hydrogen, and then specialty chemicals and plastics. These are the 4 clear winners with net upvotes of 7, and the next ones are pharmaceuticals and ammonia with only 3 net plus votes. I also see one comment which basically says, I believe that intensity targets have still to comply with absolute reductions in line with WB2D or better, and in this case I could not recognize the value realized from companies setting an intensity target. Nate, would you be able to reflect on that?
Can you repeat
you want me
it?
to repeat
I don't see it
yes.
here in the text.
Yeah, let me repeat it. I believe that intensity targets have still to comply with absolute reductions in line with WB2D or better, and in this case, I could not recognize the value realized from companies setting an intensity-based target.
So the question is basically, is there value from companies setting intensity targets?
I think so.
Yeah,
if
I mean,
not, the one who put it in should correct me now. I can't see who it is.
Okay, I think generally the SBT initiative, obviously it's a voluntary initiative, and so we've tried to introduce some flexibility, as I said, with companies, and many companies really appreciate the intensity targets, at least for their own benchmarking purposes, if not for target setting purposes. I think, in order to put the intensity targets on the same basis with the absolute targets, what the initiative does is to convert the intensity targets into absolute terms using the company's own expectations about the denominator, where there are targets that are not clearly linked with a particular commodity that has an IEA pathway. The question mentioned B2DS, that has been a reference. As I'm sure many of you know, tomorrow, actually, the IEA is publishing and releasing their updated ETP 2020. So we're hoping that will include 1.5 degree pathways for some of these commodities as well, but we'll have to see what they end up sharing tomorrow. Generally, I think that's enough. Yeah.
Sorry.
I see there's another comment on intensity here where they think it's useful, and so that's good. I think it's a mixed bag with intensity, and we're certainly not pushing anyone towards intensity. It's just offered as one option.
Ridima, could you explain a bit how that would work? Using intensity pathway for different product groups to respond to customers who engage in Scope 3 discussions with you?
Yeah, sure. So we get a lot of our customers are large CPG companies, and we get a lot of engagement from them to set targets so that they can live up to their Scope 3 target for SBTi. And often we have to push back and say that, no, listen, we're following our own decarbonization pathway, so we're not going to do it at the pace you want us to, but we sort of respond to them with, here's our science-based target. But it could be, and I think it could be useful to use an intensity pathway for a product group to sort of show that our reductions are in line with what is expected of our product group. So as a way to respond to customers, because otherwise it's a bit, this is the challenge we face with Scope 3. It becomes very hard to accommodate the different pace of decarbonization that different customers want when we're trying to follow our own plan on that as well. So I'm thinking of it more to not to replace our science-based target, but as a way to show that we're all sort of moving in the same direction, and this will help them eventually.
Okay, thank you. Let's briefly summarize what you have prioritized, although I think you can see that in this specific case. High value chemicals, 9 top upvotes, no downvotes. Specialty chemicals, 8 upvotes net, correcting for the downvotes. Likewise for plastics and hydrogen, and I see that for specialty chemicals there are multiple entries, so we need to look a bit at what happened there exactly. But these are the 4 that you prioritized by far. All the next ones are at considerable distance. So that's helpful to know, and also to see that it's kind of a difference that you included both product groups as well as products. So that's also interesting to see. Can we go to the next slide, Nate? Process emissions. So the next topic to look at is process emissions, where it's basically those emissions, CO2, but also N2O from nitric acid production, for example, those emissions that are not the consequence of burning fossil fuels, but that are the consequence of a chemical reaction in which CO2 is formed, as in the case of ammonia, or a chemical reaction in which another greenhouse gas is formed, as in the case of N2O with nitric acid. Next slide, please. Our question was, do you track and report your process emissions? The answer that almost all of you gave was yes. Then we asked, should process emissions be treated differently from energy-related emissions? 61% of the respondents said yes. Reasons for different treatment include that the source and the mitigations options are different. Process emissions are harder to abate, challenging to track, and in some cases inevitable. I think there were many different phrasings to substantiate a no vote, so an equal treatment of process emissions in comparison with energy-related emissions, but they all boil down to a greenhouse gas is a greenhouse gas, and we shouldn't distinguish. And we thought about that, and we thought, now, if we are, and that's a discussion that we also had earlier in this session, if we are going to single out a couple of products or product groups. At that moment, we still thought that ammonia and nitric acid would be high on the list. Of course, you gave different feedback, but let's assume for now that ammonia and nitric acid would be high on the list. Then, as a consequence, if we would make separate pathways for these, then the process emissions would already be the different character of that production process leading to the process emissions would already be accounted for. That's why you make a specific pathway. So then we thought, well, if we are already doing that for ammonia and nitric acid, is that sufficient, or would we need to do it for more specific processes or products? And that's the next question we ask you to poll on. Should we aim at preparing more specific intensity pathway than just for ammonia and nitric acid to capture relevant specifics for process emissions? And again, you can select yes, no, or no opinion. I know that the question is a bit disconnected from the input that you gave, but assume that despite your advice, you would nevertheless go for ammonia and nitric acid. Should we do more to capture relevant specifics for process emissions? And I see 4 people have voted. Eight people have voted now. And basically, most of you vote yes, and some vote no opinion. Okay, I think it's approximately 3/4 saying yes, nobody saying no, and 27, quarters saying no opinion. Could you please explain why you are voting yes, what you are thinking about? Anybody? So why are you voting yes?
Yeah, I think the rationale here was that in the previous poll, we were actually looking at processes that were beyond the ones that are mentioned here. So it's quite bringing in a need for looking at other ones.
Okay, thanks. Any other reason to vote yes? And any specific processes that you would have in mind then? I see Andrea's response, thinking into product-specific methods going for more product pathways is only straightforward. Okay. But so I also take that, Andreas, as yes, if you want to pay specific attention to process emissions, this is the way to do it, not in a more generic way. Is that correct? Good. That was a yes. Let's continue with the next slide. Nate? Next. Thank you. And maybe Nate, you can give an introduction. So scope 3 is maybe the most specific point of the chemical industry due to its heterogeneity and of course due to the hydrocarbon. Hence, when you incinerate it, you get greenhouse gases nature of many of the chemicals. So maybe Nate, if you could briefly substantiate how in general science-based targets deals with scope 3 emissions, then we take it from there, making it more specific for the chemical industry.
Yeah, thanks, Michiel. So the idea here is just to step back a bit, and I'd say scope 3 is the signal achievement of the Science-Based Targets Initiative so far to get companies to actually quantify and address their scope 3 emissions is definitely a new practice. We're just approaching 1,000 companies now that are committed, of which 500, approaching 500, have approved targets. Several of you on the webinar today, part of those companies. And so it's definitely a priority for us. And I think Ridhima from Novozymes already mentioned how they're being engaged by their purchasers around the intensity of their products. And so this is a perfect example of part of our theory of change here in terms of scope 3 being important to address, but also the sort of value chain orientation of the initiative on the basis of greenhouse gas protocol accounting. So I think all of you are very familiar with 15 categories of scope 3 emissions, but I just included them on the left for reference. In terms of the way that we treat scope 3, as I think all of you know, this sort of high-level category is that A, scope 3 emissions have to be quantified, and B, if scope 3 is greater than 40% of aggregate scope 1, 2, and 3, then it has to have a separate, ambitious, measurable scope 3 target. On the right side of this slide, you can see the types of targets that we have. So absolute, and then it has to be below 2 degrees. Intensity, it has to translate into a corresponding below 2 degree pathway, whether that's through the SDA, where we have specific physical intensity pathways, or other. And so a number of companies have these other intensity targets, whether it's per printed sheet for printer manufacturers or purchase products for various types of companies. And so the way that the initiative tries to assess these consistently is to make sure that there's no absolute increase in emissions corresponding with this target and the company's assumptions, and also that there's at least a 2 degree annual intensity reduction associated with this target in linear terms. Those are for the emission reduction targets, which of course are preferable, but we also still allow companies to set supplier or customer engagement targets. And so those are the two basic types. That's the general company framework that we have. We're also just finalizing a framework for financial institutions, which, as you can imagine, are also very focused on scope 3 emissions, especially category 15 financed emissions. And that's a whole sector-specific framework that we're developing that's oriented around engagement and types of intensity and action targets that they can take, which is sector-specific. So part of the question here is whether we need to develop such sector-specific scope 3 criteria for your sector, for chemical companies. And we hear from many of you that we don't think it's necessary, that it's just a global need, and chemical companies can walk in step with the rest of companies, and others say that there is a need. So that's what we're here to discuss, and that's just an overview. Now I'll pass it back for some other scope 3 discussion here.
Before doing that, maybe you can answer Julia's question, which is with SBT is new draft guidance on net zero emissions. Will these be reviewed? And will companies be encouraged to set 1.5 degrees absolute scope 3 targets aligned to net zero?
Thank you for the question. Yes. So we are releasing the net zero guidance next week. There will be a webinar that we're happy to share the information if you haven't received it already for that. And certainly the SBT initiative is encouraging companies to join the Race to Zero and 1.5 campaigns. Previous versions of the ETP didn't have 1.5 degree pathways. The most ambitious B2DS that was mentioned earlier is roughly 1.7 degree pathway. Again, we'll see what they release tomorrow. But there is, some question as to whether there's a need for additional sector-specific resources on 1.5, or we just stick with the global numbers that we have now. But we certainly will be encouraging people to join that. I don't think that we're going to increase our thresholds for ambition right now. We did do that last year, where we previously allowed 2 degree aligned targets for the scope 1 and 2 target, and now it's well below 2 degrees as a minimum ambition. I think we'll stay there for the time being. Though of course we try to incentivize companies to set 1.5 targets by differentiating those scope 1 and 2 in alignment for the temperature outcome of their ambition. And we will continue to harmonize with emerging 1.5 degree resources and campaigns.
And then we have Brian's question: with net zero, will product benefits be considered?
Good question. And it's it's been what, 1 hour and 20 minutes. So it's a very long time for a gathering with chemical companies to not have brought up avoided emissions. So appreciate that. And the answer is no. The SBT initiative does not include, nor does it expect to include in the foreseeable future, any avoided emissions crediting or calculation. It is obviously as you say, a corollary to the net zero discussion. I can tell you right now, it's more focused on negative emission carbon removal technologies and nature-based solutions, and how we do the accounting there. The greenhouse gas protocol is in the midst of a stakeholder engagement process for creating a new standard around negative emissions and land use related emissions accounting. And there are several resources being developed in this space, but none of them is presently focused on avoided emissions accounting. WRI published an avoided emissions document last year, which went through some of the challenges related to counterfactual baselines and avoided emissions accounting. And this is something that we don't expect to be covering in the SBT initiative right now. Thank you for the question.
Okay. Kylie, do you want to do the next 2 slides?
You go for it, Michiel.
Okay, Nate, could you show the next slide? So obviously, when we try to make the science-based targets methodology specific for the chemical industry, we don't need to redo all the work and refine all the work. The question is just, where is it really important to, because of the specifics of the chemical industry sector, to refine the methodology, and where the chemical industry sector is not different than the rest of the sectors, there's no need to refine the methodology. So basically what we asked in the survey is for all these scope 3 categories, which you see on the right side of the slide, for all these, where do you think the chemical industry really stand out, justifying to have a separate methodology specifically for the chemical industry. And what you see from the answer, and we had around 40 respondents, a little bit more. What you see from the answers is that use of salt products, end-of-life treatment of salt products stand out together with purchased goods and services. I think use of salt products and end-of-life products of salt end-of-life treatment of salt products is also logical to stand out due to the hydrocarbon nature of the products. Purchased goods and services maybe also due to the high hydrocarbon nature, but also due to all the complexity in the upstream value chain. Waste was a bit more puzzling for me, to be honest, but then somebody responded that many products that are waste products of chemical processes are still sold and have a value. And in that sense, it brings them closely to category 11 and 12. And this was the top 4 that came out of this, and you also see that things like business travel didn't got much support, which I think is also to be expected, because why would business travel be very different for chemical companies than it would be for other companies, likewise for employee commuting, for example. So if we can go to the next slide. And there you basically see the percentages of the preference. And I see that I forgot to say something about category 10, processing of salt products. So the further processing in the value chain, which also gained quite some support to look at specifically for the chemical industry. So I think the conclusion from that is that the survey provided us with good guidance of which subcategories for scope 3 this chemical sector specific guidance should focus on. I see Riva saying that this question is also another one where it would be helpful to see the results by subsector. I kind of follow that line of reasoning. When we made the survey, we kind of had the same feeling, not at the subsector level, but we wanted to know whether there was a significant difference if we would include the full population or just the chemical companies, or just the chemical companies producing hydrocarbons or other products emitting greenhouse gases at the end of their lifetime. And a bit to my surprise, I might add, the results are not materially different for the different samples. Would you expect further different insights than this one, Riva, that a subsector disaggregation could deliver us?
Yes, well, that's why I'm asking the question. So, but I keep saying the same thing. So I just think that industrial gases maybe have a unique business model. Okay. That needs to be understood. So that's what I'm saying.
Okay. And then to introduce the next question, it's maybe helpful to read the part on the right, where basically the guidance from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol says that in certain cases, this is about data availability, where you already indicated in the survey that data availability for scope 3 is sometimes problematic. So the question, of course, is now how to deal with that. And the Greenhouse Gas Protocol says about that in certain cases, the eventual end use of salt intermediate products may be unknown. I think that is the situation sometimes for the chemical industry. A company might produce an intermediate product with many downstream potential applications, which is exactly what we heard in the survey a couple of times, and may just be unable to reasonably estimate the downstream emissions associated with various end uses of the intermediate product. And in these cases, companies may disclose and justify the exclusion of these, but should not be selectively exclude a subset of those categories. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol shows understanding for that situation, gives a way out. But obviously, if we think about the the chemical industry and its emissions, then quite a significant share of the emissions are from the hydrocarbons when they are burned at the end of their life, in case they would be burned, and when the end of their life arrives, of course. So we thought it would be useful to think about that deeper further with you and get guidance on how to do that. Before doing that, let's take some comments in the chat. Maybe Ananda, you can talk us through it. It's too long to read.
Yeah, sure, Michel. So, what I was trying to explain is, partly also explained in the text is shown on category 10 and the complexities of tracing the value chain, and, how would you trust, let's say, the information that's being, compiled and used by company A versus B and so on. And in category 12 on end of life also has a very different problem where, because of the composite nature of, the trading of petrochemicals, you might actually assume that chemical intermediate is produced in country A and then it actually moves through multiple countries in different transformations and then finally disposed of in, in a fourth country or a fifth, right? So we have to be have a mechanism to track the actual end of life. If not, how can this be standardized? And I've also been, seeing that, what companies report in CDP for some of these categories have varying levels of, let's say, the quality of coverage or even sometimes missing information. So, that's I associate it to a gap in readiness of, companies, let's say, from lack of data or maybe from the complexity involved.
Okay. Thanks, and that's a helpful introduction to the next question that that we have for all of you. Brian, I saw your chat, point taken. I think that's a fair point. Talking you through one. No, go to the next slide, please. Talking you through one result again. Around 3/4 of the respondents from the chemical industry said that they do not or only partially know what happens with the hydrocarbon products at the end of their life, while only 27% responds that they know it fully. So I think conclusion, it is difficult to paint a full scope 3 picture at this moment for chemical companies. And then that, of course, leads to the question that Ananda already started addressing, how to deal with that in science-based target setting and what to expect and how to work with that. And you could, for example, imagine that we would come up next year with a methodology where we would allow less accurate scope 3 data than scope 1 and 2 data, which you have available anyhow, and where it would be based on approximation, typical numbers for each product or product group, which is a typical share, and there should be guidance for that then, of course, of what is landfilled, what is a typical share that is incinerated, what is a typical share that is recycled. So a very typical approach. And the question we have for you as intro for the next discussion is, next slide, please. Whether an SBT approach with an approximation of scope 3 emissions can be credible, while at the same time not being a barrier for SBT. So do you think it's in principle possible for all of us to come up with a methodology that is credible, but that is not a barrier to setting an SBT because to be credible, it became so complex that that really we cannot do that. So do you think it's feasible to get to an approach which is credible, but not a barrier? And I see many of you are already voting, and many more of you, I hope, will still vote. And I also see that the answer develops into a very clear yes. It's 90% yes versus 10% no now. So I think there's a clear majority who thinks this this could work. Let's first ask you, those of you who voted yes, which is almost everybody of you, to paint a bit what it would look like and how this would be done, and then take the questions that are in the chat. So for those of you who voted yes, how do you think such an approximation would look like? Credible, but not being a barrier.
Can I come in? This is Alka here again from Tata Chemicals, and I think most approximation of scope 3 is done with some assumptions, and these assumptions are true year on year. So, so if you follow the same system and then you work towards any reduction, so the barrier may, so there is no barrier there because you are then, it's what you're targeting is based on a certain assumption. That's what I think.
Okay. Others voting yes. What would such an approach look like?
I hope you can hear me clearly. This is from ERM on behalf of PTT Global Chemicals. So I did put some comments in the chat. So with approximation, of course, the important thing is the uncertainty. And as far as I'm aware, actually, uncertainty is a very important part of greenhouse gas accounting because, you know, everything from emission factors to the data you collect, there's a level of uncertainty, but I think most companies do not yet quantify that uncertainty. So if the scope 3 emissions are to be credible, I think there needs to be an added level of uncertainty quantification somehow. Let's say within 10 or 20%. I don't know what the margin would be, but of course it would be higher than scope 1 and 2, where we expect the uncertainty to be much lower.
Thank you. Any further comments on how this could be done, or maybe also why this cannot be done?
I feel this is Nate. I can just respond to your point. Thanks to your point. The SBT initiative, as you know, does not have any requirements around quantifying uncertainty. We are considering sort of MRV function to add to the initiative in a future phase. I don't think that it would go to this level. It would be more focused on what companies have done to achieve their target, or whether their own inventories have indicated that they're on the path to achieving their target. As you know, scope 3 uncertainty levels are much higher, and the challenge for the initiative is to support robust and transparent action that responds to the urgency of the need to reduce emissions while recognizing the data quality challenges. And so what we do there is we allow for estimation of scope 3 as a starting point, with the idea that we try to iterate and improve the quality of these data as we go. But it's an ongoing challenge. And for example, in the financial sector, you know, it's very uncertain, such that we don't even use those financed emissions numbers at this point. So your suggestions on how we navigate this in the chemical sector are welcome.
Maybe a comment here from more specialty company perspective, or even pharmaceutical chemical perspective. The farther we go in the value chain, the more complex this will be, and the more influences that we have. And I answered specifically no with respect to credibility here. Yeah, that's where I see a big challenge if we really want to make this authentic. For simplification purposes, I would strive for a clear yes, yeah, because this would make my life much easier. But if we think about the need to work together across industry sectors and countries, this will also not allow us to show when we make great achievement, for example, in the upstream value chain. So it's not easy to answer that question, and I think it was already mentioned in the chat. This really depends on the degree of approximation. Yeah, I think at the moment everybody's doing approximation, and I don't think that we can get much worse. Yeah, I also don't think that we, with a credible effort, we don't get much better. I see more a trend to work towards hybrid approaches for scope 3 to integrate this here.
Thanks. And building on that, I see quite a lot of comments in the chat which basically say approximations are fine, but if you do approximations, then how are you going to measure progress? Because if you really achieve quite a lot, but then you measure it using the standard approximation, of course, then you can't show progress. Any comment on how we could kind of combine having an approximation that still works for chemical companies, but still be able to measure progress? I take that as a no. Should you come up with ideas, obviously these are highly valuable. So please approach us also after this session. Julia, yes, I think that would work. Getting all suppliers to set SBTs. Ananda, could you maybe elaborate a bit on your idea?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the logic behind the idea is, in principle, those who are, let's say, putting the end products that are, used by consumers are also closest to the details of where they are actually, let's say, being used, and probably closest to the information of where maybe the disposals lie, right? So could that be a starting point to say, like, for example, companies that are, like, let's say, in that layer of the value chain, to set as part of their SBT commitments to fetch the data, and once you start, let's say, gathering like reliable data as part of this process, then it also becomes easier for people who are more upstream in the value chain, because those who are upstream are actually very distant from the facts, right?
Yeah. Okay. Let's summarize how you voted ultimately. 71% said yes, 24% said no, and only 6% had no opinion. If I summarize what you have said, then I think yes, it should be feasible for most of you. But it really boils down to how you do it. There's a clear willingness to embark on more data gathering. There's also a clear desire to have the partners in the value chain also to gather more data, so that you can use that, so that also over the full value chains more data becomes available. And there's the issue that if we approximate, then somehow we should find a way to approximate, but still be able to measure progress. Because if not, well, how to set targets, and also how to prove that targets have been met, and that's I think also a valuable point. Thanks for all the inputs on this one. Let's go to the next slide, Nate. This is maybe where it gets really difficult, but also very valuable to get your inputs, because you're really searching what to do and how to approach this. So I'm going to talk you through the slides, but then I end up asking you now, what type of end of life scope 3 target could SBT set? So ultimately, all I'm going to say just boils down to the question that I hope to introduce: what an end of life scope 3 target could look like. And if we look at the current situation without recycling, let's say chemical recycling, then there are two different petrochemicals company. Let's say that they produce naphtha and make polyethylene from it. The orange company produces that plastic, that polyethylene, of course has scope 3 emissions upfront from the naphtha they are using, has the scope 1 and 2 emissions, and has scope 3 emissions from the plastic incineration that we assume to be the case. And there's a green company who does exactly the same. So green has no specific meaning here. Now suppose that we have an orange company producing polyethylene still using naphtha in their naphtha cracker polymer plants. That orange company still has the upstream scope 3 emissions for the naphtha, but their product is not incinerated, it is recycled. But it's recycled in the green polyethylene producing company. So that company takes, let's say, pyrolysis oil that is made, converts it in a cracker to ethylene, converts that ethylene to polyethylene, and at the end of that lifetime, it's no longer recycled, but it's emitted. Then the way we now think, but we are not sure, and we're really open to all kinds of feedback. The way we think this would be attributed is that the orange company, so the one who doesn't use recycled products, but whose products ends up being recycled, gets the orange parts allocated, which is the scope 3 emissions of the upfront naphtha, and their own scope 1 and 2 emissions. And the green company gets the emissions from the recycled product as their upstream emissions, their own scope 1 and 2 emissions, and the scope 3 emissions from their product that is being incinerated. I guess from that you see that if it works like that, then the company processing the recycled material doesn't really see a significant decrease of emissions, or maybe even an increase depending on the scope 3 emissions of the recycled process. But the orange company sees all its end-of-life emissions from incineration disappear. Now, we may well be wrong in this, so feel totally free to say that this will be done differently. But we use this slide to kind of introduce the next one. Because we are thinking now, how can these end-of-life options for sold products be incentivized with a target? And we are basically thinking of 3 options. And the question to you would be to prioritize these again, but also to add more options. But to start the discussion, an option would be an end-of-life engagement target. So to cooperate with suppliers to sell green materials and or with waste sectors to process them differently. So to make sure that they start recycling more and incinerating less. Some pros and cons, and this is just to start the discussion. So this is by no means suggest any preference for us, because we are still developing our thinking. A pro would be that it gradually leads to an improved data accuracy. It's maybe easier to digest, less of a barrier. Con is that maybe it only indirectly stimulates reducing end-of-life emissions. Then another option would be to make an end-of-life target for scope 3 equally hard as the current scope 1 and 2 targets. Pro of that would be that it would be a strong impetus to use bio-based materials. Bio-based materials, of course, also having over the full scope 3 lower net emissions. It would also provide a strong impetus to stimulate end-of-life recycling and contribute to design for recycling, because in both cases, the company getting that target would have strong impetus to reduce their end-of-life emissions. A con could be that end-of-life recycling is difficult to control for chemical companies. So the next option, and actually we got that from the first expert advisory group meeting, is to use circular feedstock targets, where we would, for example, say that X% of the hydrocarbon feedstocks needs to be bio-based or carbon capture and utilization based or recycled based. A pro of that would be that it has the strongest impetus to use bio-based and recycled materials, 10% or whatever percentage it would be. And it sets a target at the point that chemical companies control most, because this is what you procure. And even if you are not at the start of the line, you can still tell your suppliers that you want to procure circular feedstocks. A con would be that there's no precedent in the science-based target methodology, but that's not an automatic disqualifier to the extent that I understand. I hope this is more or less clear. Ultimately, what we are trying to understand is what the scope 3 targets should look like to account for the hydrocarbon nature of many chemicals, which of course leads to end-of-life emissions when these products are incinerated. So we are no longer talking data accuracy, but assuming we know the data, what should the target look like? And the question now is again to go to the polling software, where I will now open the question. I think it is. Yes, it is. Where you can do 2 things, and I hope you do both. First of all, you can upvote or downvote these 3 options, but I think all of them have pros and cons. So I also hope that you will add new options, and then that everybody will upvote and downvote these 2, because I think there's more than the 3 options that we came up with. So please also, I see some enthusiastic voting, but please also add new options. And obviously when people do that, make sure to push the yellow button so that you load them and can prioritize them. So far, we still have 3 options, and I will share with you what I see happening. I see happening that almost everybody so far upvotes the percentage of circular feedstocks targets, and almost everybody downvotes the end of life target equally hard as scope 1 and scope 2 targets, and there's an equal amount of almost equal amount of upvotes and downvotes for the end of life engagement target. And there are no new potential ways to set targets. So please be encouraged again to also add new ones. I see a new one, which is data collection tracking target component. So basically that is about a target to improve the data availability and enable tracking. I don't see much voting on it yet, so please everybody also vote on that one. And if you don't see it, then push the yellow button on your screen. Okay, please continue to vote. Many people still to vote on the new one on data collection and tracking target components. Okay, it's quite an interesting result. So Nate, pay close attention because I'm going to ask you for a reflection. It's 13 upvotes and no downvotes now for the percentage of circular feedstocks targets. It's 13 downvotes and no upvotes for the end of life target equally hard as the scope 1 and scope 2 targets. It's mixed but almost neutral for the end of life engagement targets. And it's +8 upvotes and no downvotes for the data collection tracking target component. So if we take the answers of this group, then it would be a circular feedstocks target combined to some extent with the data collection tracking target component. What do you think, Nate? Is that doable? Do you have follow-up questions? What do you want to do with this?
Yeah, well, thanks to everyone who participated. As we noted in this slide here, the SBT initiative currently only has targets that are or can directly be translated into emissions terms to link with temperature outcomes and the Paris Agreement goals. The challenge here, naturally, we support avoiding deforestation, circular economy, other things that companies throw into their targets. The challenge is just how we link this with the temperature outcomes that we use to communicate a lot of the ambition here. And so that's what I would throw back to the 14 who have supported this. It's not to say we don't support this.
Any suggestion from these 14 people on Nate's question? So if we have a circular feedstock target, how can we align that with the carbon budget for the chemical sector? Any suggestions? Somebody help me out, please. So I see possibly linkage to waste to energy share that can be avoided, leading to improved C12. Okay.
I think he means category 12 of scope 3.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, avoided. I don't know. I mean, sure. I'm open to suggestions here. It is a challenge. It's linked, I think, for us to the avoided emissions bugaboo in terms of emissions accounting, and so the basis of all of this that enables consistency across companies and sectors and geographies is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for measuring and categorizing emissions. So this is a bigger research question. We welcome your suggestions for the chemicals sector in particular. And again, this is something that we hope to touch on in our scoping document this year. So also, if any of the folks on today think of things after this call, we welcome follow-up as well.
Yes, strongly. So please, if you have new ideas, send them to us. Then in the chat also quite a lot happens. First of all, circularity targets are usually broader than just hydrocarbons. Yes, I understand that. Obviously, the question that Nate raised, so how to link that with greenhouse gas emission budget remains relevant in these considerations. And then there's the question on data, and that getting data from suppliers through CDP may lead to different data qualities, and that would be good to get a standard for that. 3 people building on each other came to that conclusion, I think. So that's also something to think about, Nate. But let's do that outside this this call. And then we see that regulation sometimes prevents recycling. That's a more practical barrier. And we see that we need to be careful on recycling for end of life, as this can drive stewardship issues with unwanted consequences. Brian, can you very briefly elaborate on these unwanted consequences?
Sure. I mean, what I've seen in some countries without regulations requiring waste treatment is, say at the end you have green chemistry, and at the end you have a salt, and that salt may be sold on as road salt, but will have trace amounts of the chemicals that were being made in it. However, there's no requirement to check for that, and there's no regulation against it. So people would, a reasonable person would know that that is problematic and is introducing loads of unwanted chemicals into the environment, but it saves money and it avoids waste.
Okay. Thanks. So I think this is a discussion to be continued. Once again, if you have further ideas, let us know. But meanwhile, let's go to the next slide, Nate, also in view of time. Do you still want to do this one, Nate?
Sure, if you can do it in 5 minutes.
Well, actually, this is yours to do.
Touché. I had thought this was yours, Michiel, so...
Shall I introduce it?
Yeah,
let me
sure.
introduce it. So, of course, what chemical companies can do while staying a chemical company is change the portfolio of products that they make. And if they change their portfolio from energy-intensive materials to less energy-intensive materials, for example, by selling off the energy-intensive business, then their absolute emissions decrease strongly. The question that we have basically is these kind of shifts in the portfolio that chemical companies produce. Is that something that you think we should account for during the target period, which we can of course do if we have a split in subdivisions enabling a shift in sub products or product groups enabling that. And the question that we have for you is, should we do that? And I think the voting is open now.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
And good question with from Red Team. I think this is a broader question as well. In terms of one way we describe this is ring fencing. How we actually can track this over time is an open question, and the unit of accountability and interaction that we are doing in the SBT initiative is obviously the company. And so we don't penalize companies or have any tracking of companies shifting out of more emissions-intensive products into less intensive products to meet their SBT. We don't expect companies to be shifting their product mix to meet their SBTs. However, of course, that may happen, but this isn't something that we've really worried about so far. But it's kind of an open question what we could really do about this in the future in terms of accounting and tracking. But welcome folks' thoughts.
Okay, I think we get some votes, but only 6. So maybe we move on and take this further.
Yeah.
3 said yes, 1 said no, and 2 had no opinion.
Yeah.
Now we have an additional yes vote, but to all participants, if you have further suggestion on how to deal with portfolio shift in the target setting, then and the achievement of targets, then feel free to share these thoughts with us. That would be very helpful.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, let's go to the next slide, also in view of time and knowing what we still want to do with you. This is going to be very brief. We had in the survey, we asked for barriers. There was not one barrier that more than half of the respondents indicated. So apparently there's not one silver bullet that we could alleviate and then remove the barriers. But I think many barriers got some votes, as you see in this slide. But let's not go into the details for this one. Then we had a question on the benefits. There we need to admit, as you maybe saw in the report, that as we changed the question halfway, and that as we also saw that the result was quite sensitive of the exact understanding of the question, as we changed the question halfway, we don't think we got answers that we can work with, unfortunately. And we had the question on what is achievable, a set of questions. We also discussed that set of questions earlier. There, I think we didn't make exactly clear whether we were looking for intensity or absolute emission reductions. And many of the respondents answered the questions from their perspective, which was difficult to compare. So we were somewhat careful in which conclusions we could derive from that, and the conclusions that we felt comfortable deriving from it, you found in the report that we shared up front. Having said that, let's continue with next steps. Let's skip the setup of the document if you are fine with that, Nate, but let's go to next steps so that we make sure that there's sufficient time for that.
Sure. Well, thank you, Michiel, for going through and explaining all of those details of the survey results. That was informative, and we'll share more information with all of you as we go. This is just a snapshot of some of our thoughts for the final summary report that we're producing this year. It's something that, again, we welcome input if you have other suggestions or topics. I'm just conscious that all of you have stayed with us for nearly 2 hours now, so thank you for that. I'll just briefly go through some next steps, just to leave a couple minutes for any final questions or discussion points that people want to make. So this year, as I mentioned, we're in the midst of the scoping phase for this project. It's really intended to identify priorities and a work plan for the next phase. Some of the topics that we're considering have already been discussed today, but they include additional method development in terms of intensity pathways or end of life, target formulations. A question and request that the initiative receives fairly persistently from companies is additional mitigation support in terms of how they can go about meeting their science-based target once they set one. It's a potential area of work. I mentioned that the SBT initiative is planning to look into additional monitoring, reporting, and verification of targets in a future phase, and that could be chemicals oriented as well. And then finally, net zero, as was brought up earlier, is a very hot area now, and the SBT initiative is producing some new corporate sector, corporate framework resources next week. We do expect to be elaborating these for particular sectors, including financial sector, and there could be some focus on chemical sector net zero target parameters and components, if that's considered to be worthwhile. I mean, the basic situation here is that we have fairly limited resources, and we're just trying to figure out how we can use those most effectively to advance company mitigation ambition in the chemical sector. So all of your input is extremely helpful and appreciated, and having all of you participate in this call has been most appreciated, especially sticking with us for 2 hours. So I'll open it up now to see if folks have questions about what we've covered or additional topics that we didn't cover that you think we should also be thinking about as we start to put together the scoping document.
I have a question, Julia from Pro. Sorry. Apologies, I wasn't in the last meeting, so I feel like I may have missed this. Only 2 chemical companies have had 1.5 degrees targets validated. And we know, and Kylie mentioned in her introduction, we're looking at 4-point-something% reduction per year, so 50%-ish by 2030, absolute reduction to 6 to 1.5 degrees pathway. So are we suggesting in this report and through this workshop, I'm suggesting that because we know that the chemical sector is so hard to decarbonise, that our 2030 targets could be less than 50% in terms of absolute emissions reductions, while still trying to aim for 1.5 degrees by 2050? Are our interim targets going to be a bit easier?
Good question. Yeah. I think it depends on who you ask. I would make one addition to the list there that wasn't in the earlier slide, but is Bayer, which is sometimes in, sometimes out due to their self-classification for the target setting process. Their target was approved last month, and it is also a 1.5 degree target, so it's a third one. No, I think the question is a good one, and it's generally we find it's more ambitious, more rapid decarbonization pathways for electricity generation, for obvious reasons in terms of technology availability. I think it's an open question how the chemical sector compares with other emissions intensive sectors in the current 1.5 degree pathways. It'll be very interesting to see what gets published tomorrow. The answer that most of the companies have taken de facto, which has come up early on this call, is they're just they're abiding by the global 1.5 degree pathways. So they're going the same speed as everyone else, and there is no special dispensation. Whether there needs to be is one of the big questions here. So yeah, thank you for bringing it up. Michiel, anything to add?
No. Any other question?
Hi, this is Terrapon again. Just a quick one, hopefully. As you may know, most companies are trying to grow their businesses, increase their production output, and also increase profitability. I think this is more of a general rather than a chemical sector question, but and maybe to try to get some answers or solutions. How does the Science-Based Targets Initiative on the whole view the decoupling of growth and emissions, greenhouse gas emissions? Because obviously in this sector, which is competitive, everyone's trying to grow. So
Yeah.
I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, thank you, Tirpan. I think to respect everyone's time, we'll have this be the final question. We'll end it shortly. The general position of the SBT initiative is that companies can continue to thrive economically while reducing their emissions. But obviously that varies in terms of cost and technological availability per sector and geography. So, but that's the general position, and I think that's one reason we have 1,000 companies now that have joined, is that they find that they can do that. But it's a good question. I know there are still other questions, but since we're at 2-hour mark now, I think we'll have to adjourn this discussion for now. Thank you again so much for all of you for taking 2 hours of your precious time to contribute to this. We very much appreciate all of your input, and we will be following up with all of you for more input and information. With that, I think we can end this, and thanks to Michiel and Kylie as well for making this happen. Okay, take care, everyone.
Thank you all very much.